Imagine an empire stretching across two continents, a land of gilded palaces and frozen wastelands, ruled by autocrats who believed their power was a divine gift. For 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty commanded this vast territory, a realm of staggering wealth and profound poverty, of brilliant artistry and brutal oppression. It was an empire that danced to Tchaikovsky's ballets while its peasants starved, that produced literary giants like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky while its political dissidents vanished into the Siberian snows. This is the story of the Russian Empire, a colossal power built on the absolute will of the Tsar. But what happens when that divine right is challenged, not by foreign invaders but by the very people it was meant to protect? How does an empire that seemed eternal, forged in fire and ice, crumble into dust, paving the way for a revolution that would change the world forever? Our story begins not with its end, but with its grand architect, Peter the Great. At the turn of the 18th century, Russia was a vast but isolated and backward kingdom. Peter, a towering figure of boundless energy and ambition, was determined to drag his country into the modern era. He traveled across Europe, working incognito in shipyards, studying military tactics, and absorbing Western culture. He returned with a vision to build a new Russia, a maritime power with a modern army and a European-style capital. He waged a long and grueling war against Sweden to secure a coastline on the Baltic Sea. There, on a desolate swamp, he built his dream city, St. Petersburg, a window to the west. This new capital, built on the bones of countless laborers, symbolized Peter's ruthless determination. He forced his nobles to shave their beards, adopt Western dress, and attend lavish, often drunken assemblies. He was a reformer, a tyrant, a visionary, and his reign fundamentally reshaped Russia's destiny, setting it on a path of imperial expansion. Following Peter's monumental reign, the 18th century saw a succession of rulers, but none captured the European imagination quite like Catherine the Great, a German princess who seized the throne in a coup against her own husband. Catherine was a master of public relations. She corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and presented herself as an enlightened monarch, a patron of the arts and sciences. Under her rule, the Hermitage Museum was founded, and the Russian Empire expanded dramatically, absorbing vast territories including Crimea and much of Poland. Yet Catherine's enlightened image masked a darker reality. While she talked of reform, the institution of serfdom, a system binding peasants to the land in a state of near slavery, became more entrenched than ever. The massive Pugachev rebellion, a violent peasant uprising that swept across the land, exposed the deep social fractures beneath the empire's glittering facade. Catherine crushed the rebellion with merciless force, a stark reminder that the Tsar's power remained absolute and unforgiving. As the 19th century dawned, Russia faced its greatest external threat, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1812, his Grande Armée, the largest European army ever assembled, invaded Russia. The campaign was a disaster for Napoleon. The Russians employed a scorched earth strategy, retreating deeper into their vast territory, burning crops and villages as they went. After a bloody battle at Borodino, Napoleon entered a deserted and burning Moscow. With no supplies and facing the brutal Russian winter, the French retreat became a horrific ordeal of starvation and frostbite. This patriotic war, as it became known in Russia, was a defining national moment. It elevated Tsar Alexander I to the status of Europe's savior and solidified Russia's position as a dominant military power. Yet, the victory came at a price. Russian officers who had marched all the way to Paris returned home with revolutionary ideas of liberty and constitutionalism, ideas that would soon clash with the autocratic tradition of the Tsars. The seeds of discontent sown after the Napoleonic Wars sprouted in December 1825. Following the sudden death of Alexander I, a group of reform-minded military officers, the Decembrists, attempted to stage a coup in St. Petersburg, demanding a constitution and an end to serfdom. The new Tsar, Nicholas I, a staunch autocrat, swiftly and brutally suppressed the revolt. The leaders were executed or exiled to Siberia. This failed uprising had a profound impact on Nicholas. He became obsessed with preventing revolution, establishing a secret police force, the Third Section, and enforcing strict censorship. His reign was defined by the doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, an ideology that rejected Western liberalism and promoted a conservative, Russian-centric identity. While he saw himself as the guardian of order, his rigid policies stifled innovation and deepened the chasm between the state and its educated society, pushing dissent further underground. The illusion of Russia's military invincibility, so carefully cultivated since 1812, was shattered by the Crimean War in the 1850s, a conflict against an alliance of the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France, the war exposed Russia's technological and administrative backwardness. The army, though vast, was poorly equipped and led. The lack of railways made supplying troops a logistical nightmare. The humiliating defeat sent shockwaves through the empire and made it clear that fundamental reform was no longer optional, but a matter of national survival. This realization fell upon the shoulders of the next Tsar, Alexander II. Known as the Tsar Liberator, his most monumental act was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. In a single stroke, he freed over 23 million people. It was a reform of staggering scale, yet its implementation was deeply flawed. Peasants were granted freedom but were burdened with heavy redemption payments for land that was often of poor quality. Far from solving the agrarian problem, the emancipation created new grievances and fueled rural unrest for decades to come. Despite the flaws of his great reform, Alexander II also introduced other liberalizing measures, creating local elected assemblies called zemstvos and reforming the judiciary. This period of relative openness, however, also allowed revolutionary ideas to flourish. Groups of radical intellectuals, known as nihilists and populists, emerged, believing that the Tsarist system had to be destroyed. Some advocated for going to the people, attempting to incite the peasantry to revolution. When this failed, a more extreme faction, the People's Will, turned to terrorism, convinced that assassinating the Tsar would trigger a popular uprising. After several failed attempts, they succeeded. In March 1881, Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator, was killed by a bomb thrown by a revolutionary in St. Petersburg. His assassination did not spark a revolution. Instead, it brought a fierce conservative backlash. His son, Alexander III, a man of immense physical strength and reactionary views, unleashed a wave of repression, rolling back many of his father's reforms and intensifying the persecution of minorities. The cycle of reform and reaction continued, pushing Russia ever closer to the brink. The final act of the Romanov dynasty began with the reign of Nicholas II, a devoted family man who was tragically ill-suited to rule. He inherited an empire teetering on the edge. Industrialization was finally taking hold, creating a new, volatile urban working class, the proletariat, crammed into squalid living conditions. Meanwhile, revolutionary movements, particularly the Marxists, were gaining strength. In 1904, seeking a short, victorious war to quell domestic unrest and boost national pride, Nicholas's government provoked a conflict with Japan. The Russo-Japanese War was a catastrophic failure. The shocking defeat of a major European power by an Asian nation sent tremors across Russia and exposed the utter incompetence of the Tsarist regime. Public anger exploded. On a Sunday in January 1905, a peaceful procession of workers, led by a priest, marched to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar. Troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing and wounding hundreds. This event, Bloody Sunday, destroyed the centuries-old image of the Tsar as the benevolent little father of his people. Bloody Sunday ignited the 1905 revolution. Strikes paralyzed the country, peasant uprisings spread through the countryside, and mutinies broke out in the army and navy. For the first time, the various currents of opposition liberals, workers, peasants, and national minorities converged in a nationwide challenge to autocracy. Faced with the collapse of his regime, Nicholas II was forced to make concessions. In his October manifesto, he reluctantly granted civil liberties and promised the creation of an elected legislative body, the Duma. But this was a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. As the revolutionary tide receded, Nicholas clawed back his power. He dissolved the first two Duma when they proved too radical and altered the electoral laws to ensure a more conservative, compliant assembly. The revolution had been suppressed, but the fundamental problems remained unsolved. The Tsar had shown he could not be trusted, and the revolutionaries had learned a valuable lesson. Compromise was impossible. The final years of the empire were overshadowed by the strange and sinister figure of Grigory Rasputin, a semi-literate Siberian peasant who claimed to be a holy man. Rasputin gained incredible influence over the Tsarina Alexandra because of his apparent ability to ease the suffering of her son, Alexei, the heir to the throne, who suffered from hemophilia. As Alexandra's faith in Rasputin grew, his influence extended to state affairs, especially after Nicholas II left for the front during World War I. His scandalous behavior and corrupt appointments discredited the monarchy in the eyes of the public and the elite alike. The war itself was the final nail in the coffin. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed or wounded. The economy collapsed under the strain, leading to severe food and fuel shortages in the cities. The government seemed paralyzed, and the Tsar, isolated at military headquarters, was completely out of touch with the reality of his suffering people. By February 1917, Petrograd was like a powder keg ready to blow. Picture this: women standing in long lines for hours in the freezing cold, just trying to get a loaf of bread. Frustration boiled over, and before you knew it, those bread riots turned into a massive general strike. The real turning point? When the soldiers, who were supposed to fire on the crowds, decided to join them instead. Can you imagine that? Within days, the government lost all grip on power, the Tsar's authority. Poof, gone. Nicholas II, realizing he had lost the army's support, his last line of defense, had no choice but to abdicate the throne. This marked the end of over 300 years of Romanov rule. Just like that, the empire crumbled. A provisional government made up of liberal leaders from the Duma stepped in, but they faced immediate pushback from the Petrograd Soviet, a council representing workers and soldiers. This dual power created a chaotic political mess where no one really knew who was in charge. And then enter Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party. With catchy slogans like "Peace Land" and "Bread," they offered a fresh and radical vision that resonated with the desperate masses. Fast forward to October 1917, and the Bolsheviks pulled off a swift coup, marking the start of a new, intense, and transformative era. The era of the Tsars was over, and the Soviet Union was just beginning to rise. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this dive into history, give us a like and subscribe for more fascinating stories.